Thou hast the keys of paradise, O just, subtle, and mighty opium. Thomas de Quincey, author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, once described the pleasures of opium as such. At the time, opium was sweeping its influence across the entire nation of China. It was an addiction that ranged from the mightiest of emperors to the lowest of peasants, destroying China economically and morally. The opium trade, the making of modern China. In the 18th century, Britain's demand for tea and other Chinese luxury goods, including porcelain and silk, rose drastically. It was estimated an average London worker spent 5% of their total household budget on tea. Unfortunately, despite English obsession with Chinese tea, China was unimpressed with the goods Britain had to offer. The heavy wool and machine-made products held no interest in Chinese markets, thus leaving Britain to resort to trading silver for tea.
China was essentially a silver sink, right? And that all of this cash was basically flowing from Britain to China.
It wasn't until the late 1700s when Britain discovered a product that would help the balance of payments run against China and in favor of Britain. The product was opium, cultivated in India. As Britain built a monopoly on the trade, China's addiction grew, with an estimated 12 million peasants hooked on the substance. In the 18th century, when the exchange between opium and Chinese luxury goods was at its peak, Britain balanced commerce with China by exploring a new form of trade with the powerhouse nation. Unfortunately, the illicit trade led to the First and Second Opium War, two conflicts in Chinese history that would create chaos and humiliation in China for centuries to come, ending with the complete reform of China's political, social, and economic future. As Britain began to pull ahead of Western trade competitors, a privately owned company called the British East India Company began to dominate the trade industry. Unfortunately, trade with China was close to impossible.
The Chinese refused. Okay? They refused to buy any British stuff. So in order to make a profit, the British decided to choose something the Chinese would buy, which is opium.
As China continued to buy the opium up, Britain needed to explore ways to substantially increase trade to keep up with the demand. One of the factors that contributed to the drastic increase of opium being smuggled into China was a change in transportation. The need for fast, sturdy ships grew as trade between China and Britain increased. Thus, the opium clipper was created. Built with narrow decks, large sail areas, and multiple masts, the clipper became the fastest ship on sea in the 1830s. It could transport up to twice the amount of opium from Calcutta to China in a year than the bulky East Indiaman ships could. Due to China's reluctance to trade with the West, Britain began to manipulate trade to smuggle opium across Chinese borders. The Chinese government had set up a system known as the Canton System to limit trade with the West. This allowed Western merchants to trade in the port city of Canton, but only with a group of 13 government-authorized merchants called the Hong Merchants. Despite the strictly controlled exchange, Britain found clever ways of getting around the law. The opium clippers from British India would often anchor just outside Chinese territory. Chinese merchants sailing smaller ships, known as crab boats or scramblers, would come out to the clippers, collect the opium, and smuggle the product up through the rivers and through the less policed harbors. The opium trade forced Britain to explore not only new technology, but a new way of illicit trade in order to get around the bans and restrictions on opium. As the opium trade turned in favor of Britain, China encountered a serious problem. They were no longer the powerhouse country of the East, but a pawn to Western trade tactics. It broke apart the country morally and economically. Still living by Confucian perspectives, China found very little need to tax trade because it didn't contribute to the welfare of the people. Unfortunately, when the opium trade peaked, China's government was unable to make up the lost silver due to the few taxes on trade. Some pragmatic government officials debated on whether to legalize the trade in order to make a profit, but the immortality of using the trade trumped the legalization argument. The real expansion of the opium trade only began around 1834, when the East India Company began to lose its monopoly on the trade. As British merchants demanded more free trade, Britain's government decided to end the East India Company's domination. The cultivation of opium was no longer limited by the East India Company's standards, so the levels of production increased, causing the prices of opium to drop. The cheap opium, now available to all social classes, addicted millions of Chinese. The narcotic decreased work ethic, yet increased crime. Levels of addiction grew so high, it even began to corrupt the imperial troops and official classes.
As a whole, China is falling apart. Social fabric is broken.
With the immortality of the trade clear, the Daoguang Emperor finally sided with those who wanted to abolish the opium trade completely. Taking action, in 1838, he sent in one of his most trusted officials, Commissioner Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu had earlier published a memorial condemning the legalization of the drug and then cited the measures in which he had suppressed the drug traffic in certain provinces. The emperor, impressed by his technique, sent Zexu to Canton to eradicate the trade. In Canton, Commissioner Lin began by closing down opium dens and opium shops, arresting and executing some merchants publicly, and imprisoning users of opium. Then, Zexu issued an ultimatum to British merchants.
He says, look, I know that you are illegally trading in opium, and I demand that you give up your opium stocks. We're confiscating the opium from you because you know this is illegal.
Eventually, Commissioner Lin surrounded foreign factories containing the opium and forced merchants to surrender close to 3 million pounds of opium to him. Finishing off his eradication techniques, Zexu washed out all of the opium to sea very publicly. Britain immediately demanded compensation for the potential silver lost in the confiscated opium. Arguing that it was an illegal transaction anyways, China steadfastly refused to pay Britain any money. In response, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, sent a military force to compel the Chinese government to compensate their loss.
They intervened with not just a sizable fleet, but also with the latest technology. They came with iron-plated steamers, which the Chinese had never seen before.
Thus began the First Opium War, starting in 1839. Over the course of 3 years, Britain managed to capture both Hong Kong and Nanking before China and Britain settled the dispute with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. The treaty, known as the First Unequal Treaty, forced China to pay 21 million silver dollars to Britain, cede the territory of Hong Kong to Britain, and exempt British citizens from Chinese law. Also, British merchants who had only been allowed to trade at Canton were now permitted to trade at 5 treaty ports and with whomever they wanted. Crime rate went up, illegal trade increased, and China began to distort the Treaty of Nanking in favor of themselves. Small disagreements over the term of the treaty finally spurred the Second Opium War in 1856. Lasting 4 years, Britain and France joined forces to take over the city Tianjin and Beijing. The Treaty of Tianjin ended the Second Opium War, with the terms that China was to open more ports for Western use, thus opening the interior to missionaries and foreign envoys. After the 2 unequal treaties had been made, China began a downward spiral known as the Century of Humiliation. With China so open, Western countries, including Russia, Britain, and France, began to claim land and tear the country apart. Its already weak government was not able to support the country as it fell into an economic downfall. Industries that couldn't compete with the West's machine-made products collapsed and poverty spread across the country. The Opium Wars shocked Chinese government into the realization that to beat the West, they must adapt to Western technology and military. Unfortunately, not their political ideas or social structures. Without a modern system backing their modern army, China was still weak and easily defeatable. For the next 100 years or so, China struggled to find a steady government to rely on. It wasn't until 1949 when China eventually settled with communism. The opium trade was an illicit trade that changed China forever. Not only did China and Britain exchange opium for tea, but political ideas, social structures, technologies, and economic techniques were traded as well. Today, China experiences rapid social and economic development. China recently became the second largest economy in the world and is increasingly playing an important and influential role in global economy.